All right, hey guys. Yeah, sorry for the delay. And let's get started. Just give me a second. Yeah, so I kind of overslept, so I had to prepare some stuff, but I think everything's good now. And so today we'll be talking about my current camera setup, um, the gears I've used, and the lenses I use, what I think about them, and which ones I prefer and which ones I think aren't that useful to me. And all these are more of a landscape perspective. So I'm just going to show you my gear first. And let me just check. Give me a second. Checking if the stream is fine. Alright, yeah, the stream's fine. So the first, since I can't really show you, I can't really have a phone or anything just pointing straight at me for like the gear showing, so I just took some pictures. Just drag it here. My main camera body is the, one second. So my main camera body is the Sony A7R3. I switched, I think, 2 years ago from Canon. What made me make the switch is because of the dynamic range and how quick of a shutter it has, I guess. And to be honest, all my lenses are still Canon, and the reason why is I just used an adapter for if you're doing landscape photography. You don't really need a native lens because sure it's a lot quicker to focus, but let's say you have invested over $10,000 in gear. There's not really a need to switch lenses yet, and I'll show you the reason. This was taken with the Sony and a 16 to 35 on a 16 to 35 Canon lens. You can't really tell any problems, and I've been using adapters for maybe 2 years now. I personally find that sure the focus isn't that great, but if you're photographing a landscape, it's not really like portrait shooting. The person's not really going anywhere. So if you already invested in, let's say, a Canon or a Nikon, and you switched a camera body completely, I don't really think there's a reason to completely switch your lenses unless you're doing, let's say, weddings or you're doing a lot of portrait and fast-paced environment. What I love about the GM is the Sunstar. The Sunstar is actually really really nice. On the Canon, it's quite big, but if you're photographing on the GM, it's these tiny little super long stars. It looks really nice. So that's probably the main difference, I guess. Everything else you can pretty much edit in post. So yeah, as for camera body, the Sony is really dynamic. So I'll show you. Let me show you some raws. Let me see if I have any raws here. So, and this is the main reason why I love the Sony sensor. The dynamic range is really really crazy. So if you see this photo, you can see that a lot of the darks and the shadows are pretty much lost. Let's see. But you can bring it all back. And there's a question about which adapter I'm using. I'm actually using the Sigma MC11, I think, the adapter, because I used to do a bit of portrait shooting, and I mainly focused on my Sigma 50, and that's the reason why I kind of got the Sigma, and also it's half the price as the Metabone. And I'm thinking that because I don't really use the Canons for anything fast paced. I don't really need a I don't really need a better connect better connection between the lens and the camera versus the Sigma. I want to get the Sigma as native as possible because for shooting with a portrait lens, especially a prime, if you're doing like a f1.4, you want to be focused. If you miss a bit, like if you get the eyelashes, you're not going to get the eyes. So you pretty much need to be on point. That's why I did the Sigma. And I really like the MC11. I think that's the model. It's it Even for my Canon, I still find that as long as there's contrast in the landscape, or anything if there's anything that the kind of separates the two colors, it will focus on there. But for nighttime, you're pretty much needing to manual focus. And this is the photo captured by the Sony. You can see that the sensor, you can make a very, very dynamic image straight from one shot. You don't really need to do any exposure stacking. And that's why I really love it. Because if you're going there to take, let's say, a lower exposure shot, a well exposed and an overexposed, you kind of, it's really hard to chase sunsets and sunrise because it keeps changing every second. And for the Sony, it kind of lets you get all of that in one shot. And I'll zoom in to show you the details. And this was actually shot handheld. If I had a tripod, I could get the foreground way more sharp, and you can see that the sensor of the A7 III series is really crazy. You can get pretty much everything as long as you underexpose a tiny bit. The Sony is really, really good at capturing the shadows, and it's also really good at capturing the highlights. Let's see, have you thought about swapping for Sony/others? Yeah, so I was originally a Canon user ever since I started, but let me just show you a Canon shot. Yeah, so this is a Canon shot. This is shot on the Canon Mark IV. We can just look at the details first. And at the time, I wasn't really that not that experienced with using camera settings. I always did 100 ISO. I pretty much did a random f and a random shutter speed. Normally, I would keep the shutter speed high to keep the image in focus. So there's a lot of times where I did like f4 and shutter speeds like 1 for 2000 or something. So that was a shame, but yeah. So this is the Canon. Let's lower the highlights to see what we get. I can't really compare this to the previous photo because this image was shot a bit in the middle for exposure. So we can see that. It's not very noticeable, but you can see that the details in the Canon's a lot harder to recover versus the Sony. And you see this, you notice this most when you're doing more portrait, because I shot on both the Canon Mark IV and Sony A7R III for portrait, and you can tell that the Sony's a lot more detailed. And that's one of the reasons I switched, because before the Sony had battery issues, but with the release of the A7 III series, the battery is pretty much the same as the DSLR, and it's a lot more compact, as well as the image quality and dynamic range is a lot better. That's why I made the jump. But to be honest though, if you're already heavily invested in, let's say, a camera body that's another brand, and it's one of the newer ones, there's not really a point to actually make a jump, because at the end of the day, it's really depends on how you photograph, and it's not really about the gear. The gear does matter to a certain point. Let's say you're using a cropped sensor camera and versus a full frame, there's going to be a lot of difference. But once you get to the pretty much the end game of camera gear, it's most of them are the same. As well, as long as you're using the settings correct, and you're yeah. So I want to show you an Iceland photo where I was not using the settings correct. So for the entire Iceland trip, I did have a tripod, but I never really used it. Till this day, I'm still regretting about it. So just want to let everyone know, if you're ever traveling and it's dark and you have a tripod, use it. Does not matter how many photos you get. Let's say you can get 200 photos handheld, but you can only get 10 photos with a tripod. It's quality over quantity, and I'll show you why. So this was handheld. It's pretty much in focus, but the problem is the ISO is 500. You can see that the details are not that detailed. Everything's a bit grainy and noisy. But let's say if you're going to preset it, you won't really notice much, I guess. Like, you're not really going to notice much because presets will just won't really push the details to very insane levels. But what you will notice is that, let's see, you can't really tell, especially on a computer. And when you upload it to Instagram, you won't be able to tell even more that this is actually not that great of a photo. But if you're doing kind of my style of editing, you want everything to be very, very sharp and very, very clear. And when I see these blotches kind of noise and areas where you can't really tell what they are, it's close to impossible to even edit. And that's pretty much 90% of the photos I took in Iceland. So it doesn't really matter the camera gear you have. If you're going to just use I guess bad settings, you're not really going to get a good photo compared to, let's say, using a cheaper camera and actually using settings that will work. Like for this shot, I could have done a longer exposure. I mounted on a tripod, could have done like 2 seconds, did ISO 100 and let's say f8. This image would have been super sharp. And I'll show you one of those shots. So yeah, this one. So this one was in the morning and it was shot, I think it was 2 seconds. And you can see that you can even see the grass kind of popping out. And this was on the same camera. The lens was different. The previous one was 16-35. This one's 70-200. But you can pretty much tell this. You can pretty much tell that everything is super detailed, and there's not really much noise. That's why. But the thing about using a tripod is, or shooting under low light and doing ISO 100 is you will always need long exposure. So you will never be able to capture the waterfall right at the moment. It will always be really streamy or milky. But what you do get is details, and I think details are a lot better than having extra noise and capturing, let's say, the waterfall at the moment. In regards of, I guess, my type of editing, but if you're going to just preset or upload to Instagram, maybe doing, let's say, 1,000 ISO is probably fine. I know people who do, let's say, 6,400, and they still upload it because you can't really tell under smaller screens. When the image is full resolution, you're going to see little, even here you can see little patches of noise here, kind of. Once you crop the image down to phone, or like tablet or phone viewing resolution, you won't really notice this much. Let's see. So my let's talk about my previous cameras, and why I made the jump. So Canon Mark IV I used ever since it came out until 2 years ago. It was a really nice camera, I guess, but the main thing is, I didn't really like the one knob. So let me just show you. I don't have a picture of the Canon, I think, but I have the other one, which is pretty much the same. Yeah, so it's something like this. The main problem I had was when I was photographing, I only had one knob, and the dial only switched aperture or shutter speed, versus the Sony, which had two. You can adjust shutter speed and aperture while you're shooting without actually going into the screen and tweaking it, which was very convenient, especially when times in the equation. So you're chasing sunset and you want to switch your settings quickly. Also, this was pretty heavy, so if you're doing a lot of long hikes and stuff, the weight can actually get to you. Let me check the questions. When you're not focusing on a specific subject, do you focus on infinity or 1/3 of the frame, etc.? Let me grab a lens. 1 second. Yeah, so I'm not sure what other lenses are, but for the Canon, when you're doing the manual focus, there's going to be a little, like, there's going to be a little thing like, let me make this clear. There's going to be a so there's going to be a little thing like that, and then there's going to be infinity. I normally put if I'm doing anything that's really far away, I just put the line here, and then I double check it after I photograph it. Most of the time it's in focus, and anytime I move or zoom the lens, I would set the dial back to here as well. Or there's other times where I just put it in the middle. I'm not too sure about the focus ring exactly, but what I find to work is normally somewhere here, or exactly on this line. My images come out pretty sharp. But yeah, so if anyone has any information on that, or if you want to correct me, you can also just let me know, and yeah, we can learn something new together. So back to the camera body. The Mark IV I think shoots at 32 megapixels or something, which is not really that big of a difference, because now even if you're shooting at, let's say, 24 megapixels, you can just expand your image to, let's say, 40, and it won't really be noticeable, especially for printing. But yeah, so it was just a lot of user issues, I guess. The Mark IV shutter speed wasn't as high as the Sony, as well as the aperture rings and whatnot. Especially, so I actually didn't really enjoy jumping to the Mark IV. It didn't really make much of a change. I thought it was going to be a big difference, but turns out not really, because I used to use the Canon 5DS. This was actually my first full frame. What what this camera shot at was like 50 something megapixels, so the images were pretty huge. And let's see, if you see my Canon beach photos, that was taken on the 5DS, but I don't think I have one here, but I can check. Let me see. Let me check let's see. Yeah, so this one. So this shot was by the 5DS. You can you can't really tell a difference between 5DS and the Canon Mark IV. The only thing these two have, I guess, is that if you're doing video, the Canon Mark IV actually films at 4K, but I never really did any video. As well as the Canon Mark IV has touchscreen on has a touchscreen on the display. So if you're filming or if you're trying to focus, you can just tap the screen and it will focus for you. That was a pretty convenient option, but but if you're shooting through the viewfinder, you're pretty much never going to use it. As well as the screen dims, so you won't really. You have to actually do. You actually have to pretty much. I guess. What's it called? Live view, I think. You have to do live view to actually access it. And the Canon, the 5DS is really amazing actually. It's just at the time I wasn't really experienced with camera settings, so I thought maybe jumping camera models would improve my photography, which clearly wasn't the case, because I had to learn years after that gear wasn't really the reason behind good photography. It's a lot of times it depends. I mean, it's mainly depends on your angle, your perspective, and the settings you use. And what I find is back then, I actually used better settings than, let's say, a year after. This was Canon Beach, I think, in 2017, versus my Iceland photos in 2018. The Iceland photos were a lot more regretful, I guess. There's things I would change for the Canon as well. I mean, the Canon beach photos as well. But these photos are, when I don't cry when I look at it. When I look at most of my Iceland raw files, I kind of want to just go back and redo everything, because I feel like every shot was pretty much messed up. Because there's another thing about Iceland was when I was there, one of my camera lenses, I accidentally switched off the image stabilization. So because it was a 70 to 200 lens, most of the shots I shot during the time was pretty much out of focus. So that was pretty sad, but yeah. And the first camera I ever had was a Canon T3i. I think my dad got it for my high school graduation. So when I first started photography, I kind of used his little camera to play around and learn. Didn't really learn that much, as you can see from Iceland, but yeah, let me just show you another Iceland photo. So this is probably one of those photos that I'm actually okay with, because for once the image actually has some details, but you can see that the details still aren't that great. and that's the reason is ISO 160 f4. If I just use the tripod, all this would be fixed, but yeah, never decided, like using a tripod never entered my mind, so really sad about that still, or salty I guess. But and this was shot on the Sony A7 III, was a 16-35. You can bring out, and to see how detailed your image is, you just bring your shadows up to 100, highlights to -100, and you can tell that the image is in focus, but the details aren't sharp. And that's what I find about, maybe it's the camera lens, especially if it's adapted. Shooting at f4 and a little bit of ISO will actually make an image not that great. But once you mount it and you actually do f4 and you do a longer shutter speed and a ISO 100, you're actually going to get a really sharp image. Like, let's see, let me find an image for you. Like this one. This one was, I think, actually f4 for 2 seconds. And you can see the difference between a tripod f4 and 100 ISO versus a handheld. And the thing about taking the photo is that if you get a focused image, it's so much easier to process in Photoshop. Like Photoshop, you can fix everything, but if your initial image is really off, it's just so much more extra work. And that's why now I think quality over quantity. So if I can only get 10 shots, and I know the 10 are going to be good ones, I prefer to do that than get more angles and, let's say, get 100 shots, because having 10 shots that you can actually work with is a lot better than 200 photos that you kind of look at but you end up not using, or you end up using but you always have this idea in the back of your head that if you could have done this better, you know. Now for lenses. So back to the lens photo. These two are my essential lenses, the 16-35 and 70-200. If you're doing landscape photography, I personally suggest having a very wide angle, such as the 16-35. I never tried the 12-24, but I did watch a lot of videos, but I ended up not using it because it felt way too wide, especially if I want to do a wider shot, I can pretty much stitch it. So the 16-35 for me, I think, is the sweet spot where the distortion isn't too much, and I can also get a bit of zoom. My second lens is the 70-200. I have a 24-70. Let's see. And I'm not using, yeah, so for anyone that's just joined, I'm not really using the Canon lens because it's better than the Sony. I'm using it because I don't really want to switch yet. I don't really see a point. Unless, let's say, Sony gives me a 50% off all their lenses, then I will switch to GMs every single one of these. But, you know, that's too good to be true, so I'm just going to stay with my Canons until maybe for another 10 years. or until they do give me the 50% discount. So the reason why is, yeah, I don't really see any difference. My friend's shot on the GM, I compared it with the shots I took. As long as you're using the settings properly and you're not doing anything dumb, everything looks almost the same. The difference is pretty much the Sunstar, and there's going to be some color and edge clarity, but that's really not really that big of a deal. And when I travel, I always carry the 16 and the 70 to 200. These one is for further away, one is for more grand. I had a 24 to 70, but I just never use it anymore. Reason being is 24 is not wide enough and 70 is not zoom enough. It's really good if you, I think the 24 to 70 is really good if you only have one lens that you can travel with, and you're going to let's say a city, and you're going to some nature. But if you can carry more lenses or you can handle the weight, I would suggest a 16 to 35 and a 70 to 200 for best details. But if you're doing, let's say, backpacking or a lot of hiking, I think there's also a lens that's like 14 to 105 or something. I never tried, but I think that would also be a really good option. Maybe one day I'll give that a try and I'll do a video on it, but I haven't used it, so I can't really recommend it. But these are the setup I use. These two together plus a tripod, it's a bit heavy, but I can manage. Let me just check what else to cover. Let's see. Yep. Alright, so yeah, I'll go over adapters again. So this is actually the adapter. Yeah, so the MC11. When you're adaptering with the MC11, you still get eye autofocus, and during daytime the focus speed's still pretty quick. Not really instant like the native lenses, but it's, for me, I think it's enough. I don't think there's any light leaking. I checked all the photos I've taken. I haven't really noticed any problems. It's pretty tight, but when you're using an adapter, it's better not to be under a rain day or a snow day, because versus like you're using like a GM on the full frame, it's a lot more weather sealed. Once you use an adapter, the cameras, I'm not too sure how weather sealed it is, but I've read enough to know that water can leak in. As for portrait, I used to use the 50 Sony, not Sony, Sigma Art. It's a really sharp lens and it's really amazing. I also picked up a 85 f1.8 for the Sony. The focus, and that's the only native lens I have for Sony, and this focus speed is really quick, and the details are pretty good because it's a prime, but nothing too noticeable. All right, and non-essential lenses, yeah, I've covered that. The last bit is accessories. So tripod, I think for tripod you just need any tripod for your needs. If you're doing a lot of hiking, you should totally get a lighter tripod. But if you're doing, let's say, a lot of city and stuff, it's totally fine to just buy a cheap one, as long as it can support your camera. And for support, I personally think that if I can mount a 70 to 200 and do a 30-second exposure, and the image turns out sharp and not blurred, like you don't have any shaking, I think that tripod is good enough. And I personally, I use I just used like a cheap Manfrotto one. I think I bought it for $190. The leg's kind of broken, but it does what it does. Because for me, if it does the job, I don't think I need to switch it. I don't really, after all these years, I kind of realized that I don't need the newest and I don't need the best or the most expensive. I just need gear or accessories that kind of do their job. And once you get used to them, it's really quick as well. So yeah. And as for filters, I said in the previous videos, I don't really use filters that much. The first filter I ever got was when I bought my first full frame lens, and I wasn't really, I wasn't, I guess I wasn't that knowledgeable about photography yet. So the guy offered me a filter. He's like, "Yeah, would you like a filter with that? You don't really want to scratch your lens, right?" And I'm like, "Oh, right, you're right. Yeah, let's get a filter." And then he's like, "Yeah, here's a solarizer filter for like $70. It'll definitely protect your camera and it'll also block out some sunlight." And I'm like, "Wow, cool, thanks." So I got that, and then later I was like, if my lens is glass and the filter is like plastic, then isn't that, and I'm shooting through the plastic, wouldn't that be ruining image quality? And to scratch a lens is pretty impossible. So unless you're really rough with your lenses, or you're dropping it, or you're not careful, the lens surface I don't think will ever scratch. With my years and all my lenses I've used, I don't think any of them has gotten scratched, because you have a lens cover. And yes, just don't put your lens in a bag with other stuff. Just keep it tight and secure and put a lens cap on all the time. It'll totally be fine. So if you're ever going to a camera store to get a lens and they offer you a filter, you can, like, you just, I always say this to them, like, "Is it free?" And then they just look at me and laugh, and then I laugh too, and then they're like, "Yeah, you don't need it." But yeah, I think it's a sales tactic. So you don't ever need a solarizer filter or a filter that protects your lens. And even if your lens gets scratched, it's not really, you won't ever notice it unless you're doing like f22 or like a super, so it's totally fine. Especially if you're doing portrait and you're doing f1.4 like most of the time, you're never going to notice a scratch. And that can also get you a good deal on buying secondhand lenses. What I was gonna say something, but let me think. But I don't remember. Huh. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for today's video. It's a pretty short one, I guess. If there's anything I didn't cover or you want me to cover, just leave a comment or send me a message, and I'll get to it. Thanks for tuning in, and for tomorrow I'll be doing Learn With Me. So we'll be creating reflections in Photoshop. Same time, and thanks for tuning in.